Please be seated. It's been a bit of a tough weekend. I don't watch the news. I've told you all that before. But it's been hard to avoid all the remembrances and everything like that. I turned on the radio in my car this morning. I still listen to the radio because sometimes I just don't want to mess with my phone and all that kind of business. And I turned on the radio and it was that memorial song that I swear, your heart is made of stone if you don't cry. And I stabbed it to change the channel. I have to preach this morning. I don't want to cry. It's that medley like they used to do in the 80s and 90s where people's voices are interspersed in, and I mean, it just kills you. It tugs at your heartstrings, and it's been hard to avoid that this is the anniversary of September 11th, even if you wanted to, which I didn't necessarily. And my kids have been asking some tough questions. Maybe you've heard some questions from the children in your life, or even from the adults in your life, or even from yourself, and so when there's all these tough questions, sometimes I do what Jesus did, and that came to some of us here at Holy Trinity, and so we decided to tell a story. It's called Sadako and the Thousand Paper Cranes. I read this story when I was a kid. I read everything that wasn't nailed down, and so when it probably wasn't appropriate and I didn't understand, I read this story, but it stuck with me. It was one of those that stays with you your whole life. And it seems appropriate for today. Sadako was a little girl who lived in Japan a long time ago. She was 2 years old when something terrible happened to her city. She didn't know what it was, but she knew that 1 minute her city was there and the next minute her city was gone. 10 years later, when the city was being rebuilt, she got sick. Her mother called it the bomb sickness. And she was really sick. And she was in her hospital bed, and there's a legend in Japan that if you fold 1,000 paper cranes, if you make them out of origami, that you'll be granted a wish. And so she laid in her hospital bed, and she folded cranes and folded cranes and folded cranes because I think that's all she could do. It's not a prayer, but it seems kind of like a prayer, to be folding these cranes with your hands, and there's nothing else you can do. And she ran out of paper, and then she borrowed paper from fellow patients, and she folded bandages, and she folded anything she could get her hands on, and she folded all 1,000 by the time she died when she was 12. They were buried with her. But what happened to Sadako is that now there's a statue of her at what's called Ground Zero in Hiroshima. There's a statue of her, and there's cranes like these, and people still fold cranes. And each year, 900 tons of cranes are shipped to Hiroshima and sit under the memorial to Sadako. Still people fold cranes for peace. Still people fold cranes when they don't know what to do. And so I thought this weekend, when we're figuring out what to do 10 years later, we still don't know. There are still all these questions. What do we do? What do we do with them? What do we tell our children about what happened? What do we tell our children about how we feel about it? The other thing that we can do is we go back to the Bible. Sometimes it's the last place that we go when we're seeking answers and comfort. We go so many other places, but today we have this wonderful story. We don't pick these scriptures. This is what came up. This is what comes up every 3 years, is this story about forgiveness. And this is where we go when we need peace, when we need comfort, when we need some kind of answer. Jesus was teaching, and Peter came up to him, and I think sometimes Matthew's gospel needs to be called Peter's gospel because Peter does all these strange things that are kind of turning points for Jesus' ministry, and there's an argument that Peter was a child, that Peter was a teenager, around 13 years old, because he was apprenticed to his dad. And sometimes when we get these questions from Peter, I think that's probably right. He comes running up to Jesus and says, "Jesus, how many times do I have to forgive somebody?" And I don't know if he was talking about something specific. Probably, I would think. But he comes running up to Jesus and says, "How many times do I need to forgive?" As many as 7 times. Now, 7 doesn't seem like that many. until I thought about things at my house. How many times do you forgive your sister for trespassing into your room? How many times? As many as 7 times? Because that's a lot for a 6-year-old. 7 times to forgive someone for going into your room, that's unimaginable. 1 time would be a lot. 2 times is when they start to yell, "Mom" or "Dad, they're coming into my room." Forgiveness is really hard. 1 time or 2 times or 3 times. And so for Peter to say 7 times, that's really a lot. That's almost more to think of, but 7 is a nice round number. I'm sure Peter, a disciple of Jesus, thought he was being generous in saying 7 times, I need to forgive my brother or my sister. And then Jesus, like we do in times of crisis, tells him a story and says, not 7 times, Peter, 77. Other translations say 70 times 7. 490 times, and you can see Peter wilting. 490 times to forgive my brother and my sister. I can't imagine that in my house. It's an unimaginable way of forgiveness. And Jesus seems to be talking about it as a way of life. Jesus seems to be talking about this as 490 times. It's not something that we keep track of. And the story he tells points to the fact that God doesn't keep track. That God doesn't keep track of our wrongs, and so, like the person in the story, nor are we to keep track of those wrongs. Well, on a weekend like this, that's really hard. That's really tested in all of us when we hear this again and again and we see the footage of those planes and we relive it. I know, I was there. I was in downtown Atlanta, and I don't know if you remember this, but we thought the Bank of America in downtown Atlanta was going to be the next to be hit. We didn't know. We were so afraid. And so the only thing that all of us could think of would be to get out of downtown, to get into someplace safe, wherever that was. We didn't know anymore where a safe place to be might be. We didn't know. I remember how hard it was. I remember the fear, just like you do. But still, we have this call. 490, 70 times 7. We have these things, and I don't know how we put them together. It's a call that seems to be beyond us. And still it's there. And we remember at the same time how hard it was and how much fear we have. And so I thought, what can we do now? My children were not alive, were not born yet 10 years ago. And yet, they're at the age where they're asking questions now. That's how much time has passed. They're saying, why did this happen? My daughter didn't know that the planes flew into the towers on purpose until this week. She's almost 9. They weren't there. They don't know. And so I thought, what do we want to give a child? What legacy do we want to leave a child? If we can't comprehend forgiveness for this act, what do we want to do for the children among us? We have children here in the pews, in Sunday school this morning, in our communities, in our lives, that have no memory of this event, that don't know. They'll only hear the stories that we tell them. And so what are they going to hear? In Sunday school that starts this morning, they'll hear virtues. They'll hear a virtue each month that's taught from the Bible that includes a Bible story. And the virtues, they're not hatred, and they're not revenge, and they're not getting back at someone, and they're not holding grudges. The virtues are knowledge, and their generosity, and gratitude, and creativity. This is what we're giving our children, so that when they are faced with something like this in their generation, I pray that it isn't so, but it's been so for all of us. When they're faced with something like this, what can they fall back on? They can fall back on stories. They can fall back on the Bible. They can fall back on these virtues that we're teaching them, so that they'll know about forgiveness and they'll know about responses to tragedy. Creativity, how wonderful is that? Like Sadako, in the face of tragedy, folding things, making something beautiful with your hands when you don't know what else to do, when forgiveness seems so far away. And knowledge, knowing these stories so well that they become a part of you, so that when you have a time like this, you can go back to those stories and you can think, well, what did Jesus do? And how did Jesus respond? And how does that give me strength and hope in my life? In this story, Jesus tells this story about amazing forgiveness, and it's that we can remember. It's that we can fall back on. A friend of mine, Sue Gamelin, who used to be the assistant to the bishop in our synod and is a wonderful, wonderful pastor. She's retired now. She says she's blissfully retired now. And what does she do in her retirement? She teaches Sunday school. She teaches Sunday school to young children, and she said, she asked them recently, where do you see fighting? Where do you see evil? Where do you see hatred in your life? And she thought that they might say Afghanistan or Iraq or Al-Qaeda or Osama bin Laden or something like that that's been in the news, but instead they said, we see it at my school. We see it on the bus. We see it at the park. We see it in my home. That's where they see hatred and evil and injustice and all of these things. That's where they see these things in the world. And that's where we can give them the resources to start with the small things in their lives, so that they can know, these children in our lives, we can start with them and tell them that God loves them no matter what. Because if they know that, they can be the child that does not perpetuate violence. They can be the child that has those virtues in their lives. We know, we remember this weekend. We remember how hard it was. I don't understand those signs that say never forget, because how could we? If we were there, how could we possibly forget? But we have something else. We have things that are older than this story. We have things that will comfort us in all kinds of times, in small ways and in big ways. We have the stories that we can tell each other, the stories of Jesus. We can tell the stories of a God to our children and to each other, the story of this God who always, and sometimes I think only, calls us to bringing life out of death, to resurrection. Amen.